Good morning and welcome. Thank you for being here. A few moments before we got started, we were having some technical problems, and I noticed the irony of I'm about to speak on how to speak up without freaking out, and here I was freaking out that this thing wouldn't work. So we'll get through this together. So my goal today is to get us from there to here. How do we feel more comfortable and natural when speaking? So today what I'd like to talk about is how we can really focus on enhancing our credibility when we present and how we can manage the anxiety that goes along with presenting. And it's early in the morning. Some of you might not have had all of your coffee, so I'm going to get you up and doing some things as well. So if you're comfortable, I'm going to ask you to join me at certain parts this morning of participating in this activity. You don't have to if you don't want to, but it should be fun, and I believe the best way to learn is by doing, so we'll focus on doing that as well. So let me start with a question. It's classes without quizzes, but I'm going to give you a quiz anyway. What happens in 37 seconds? The average American takes 37 seconds to brush his or her teeth. My 8-year-old son can tie both shoes in 37 seconds. He's very proud of himself. But for the purposes of what we're talking about today, 37 seconds is how long it takes for your audience to form an impression of you. That's not very long. It's even shorter if they're only paying attention to your nonverbal behavior. It takes about half a minute for us to pay attention to what the person's saying to truly understand if we want to pay attention to them more or not, if we're going to like what they're saying, etc. So that impression happens very quickly. All the research tells us that within that half-minute window is also when most of us are most anxious about speaking. So we've got a really tough task. While we're most nervous, that's when you all are forming the impression of me as a speaker. So we need to figure out how to do that and how to manage it. And for me, it all boils down to credibility. Credibility is the only currency you have as a speaker. So we need to learn how to establish our credibility without causing damage to our audience in terms of if they're going to follow us or not, or hurting our message that we're trying to get across. So credibility is key. And when I talk about credibility, what I'm talking about is our believability and our trustworthiness. And that's really all you have as a speaker. If your audience doesn't believe you, if they don't trust you, it doesn't matter how powerful your message is. So there are two types of credibility. There's what I call resume credibility. That's where you just tell people about yourself. And then there's the authentic credibility that you show. And that show is what you do when you present. It's the stories you tell. And it's really about that authenticity that I want to discuss today. And we need to make sure that we feel confident and comfortable in order for us to be authentic when we present. So I want to introduce you to an equation, which is highly ironic because math was never my forte. But I want to introduce you to a credibility equation. And today we're going to talk about the three key components that go into that credibility. First, it's your knowledge. Not just your knowledge of the topic you're discussing, but it's also the knowledge of your audience. Second, it's your confidence. And that confidence comes from managed anxiety. And it's also connection. It's the connection that you have to your audience. So we're going to talk about each of those three in turn. The first set of this, I use examples of apples, not Apple computers, but apples, so we'll get to that right away. There are really two types of knowledge that you have as a speaker. There's the knowledge of your topic. That's your domain expertise. Does anybody know what an expert in apples is called? And I'm not talking about the Genius bar at the back of the Apple store. A pomologist is an expert in apples. And if I am an expert in apples and I'm up here to deliver a lecture on the importance of apples and the variety of apples, I need to understand what my audience brings to that lecture as well. So my audience knowledge, when I talk about apples, might be thinking about something very different than I'm thinking about. So as a speaker, I have to manage my domain expertise as well as my knowledge of the audience. And that's where it all starts. I have a very strong bias. As a speaker, my job is to be in service of my audience. Most communicators, when they start communicating, start by saying, here's what I need to say for my audience. And I think the more proper approach is to say, what does my audience need to hear from me? It sounds like verbal jujitsu, where I'm just moving words around, but it is fundamentally different. If I take my audience's needs first, then it changes what I say and how I approach them. So we have to really understand our audience's knowledge. And if we do this, this allows us to avoid the curse of knowledge. The curse of knowledge is where we make assumptions, we go too quickly over certain foundational information. We use jargon, we use acronyms. We don't appreciate the audience's need. So we must avoid the curse of knowledge. We have to really reflect and say, what is it my audience needs at this moment to better understand my concept? And I want to give you some examples of where this has gone wrong. There's a durable goods company out of Northern Europe called Electrolux. Has anybody heard of Electrolux before? Okay, they sell washing machines, refrigerators, and they also sell vacuum cleaners. And many years ago, they ran this ad campaign. Nothing sucks like an Electrolux. And here they're trying to demonstrate that the power of this vacuum cleaner was so powerful that it pulled the Leaning Tower of Pisa askew. It turns out, though, that people in North America don't like to buy things that suck. So this was a miserable advertising campaign. It didn't work well because they didn't appreciate the audience and what the audience thinks. This isn't just in marketing in terms of goods and services. In the literature world as well, there was a big issue. John Steinbeck, wonderful author, grew up pretty close to here. When his book, The Grapes of Wrath, was translated for the Japanese market, they mistranslated it and the book didn't sell at all. Rather than The Grapes of Wrath, it was sold as Angry Raisins, and nobody bought the book. Again, getting the right message to the right audience is what you need to do as an effective communicator. I want to give you an example of when this worked well. Are any of you from Texas? A couple of you, excellent. So validate what I'm saying. How many of you have visited Texas? Excellent, okay. So you'll know the punchline of this story shortly. I borrowed this story from a wonderful book called Made to Stick. Made to Stick is written by Dan and Chip Heath. Chip teaches with me at the business school, and Dan runs a nonprofit in the city. Wonderful book if you're interested in learning to communicate better. And in the book, they tell the story of Texas in the mid-1980s. They had a tremendous littering problem in Texas. Litter everywhere. And it was costing a lot of money, and it was hurting the pride of the state. So they invested in this ad campaign. Some of us are old enough to remember this in this room. You remember the name of this guy? Woodsy the Owl, that's right. Give a hoot, don't pollute. He and Smokey the Bear came out around the same time, but Smokey clearly dominated. Okay? So give a hoot, don't pollute. They invested in this public service campaign. They ran ads on television and radio. This is way before the internet. And something amazing happened. Texans didn't like Woodsy. They, in fact, saw an increase in littering after this ad campaign was run. So this frustrated those in government. So they hired a bunch of academics. They said, help us fix this problem. It's costing money. It's hurting our pride. Our reputation is at stake. So these academics came in, and the very first thing they did was looked at who was doing the littering. Ladies, this is not going to surprise you. Mostly men. And not just any men. It was men between the ages of 18 and 34. And further, they wanted to know, what about these men? What makes them tick? And if you've been to Texas or you're from Texas, you know that people take great pride in being from the state of Texas. Being Texan is very important to them. And based on that, they created the message that all of us have seen if we visited Texas, the Don't Mess with Texas campaign. Within 2 years, they reduced littering in the state of Texas by 80%. Getting the right message to the right people can have a dramatic effect. But you only do that by reflecting on who your audience is and what their needs are. So we need to do that in all of our communication. If we do this, it helps us focus our message. One of the things we learn, and I borrow this advice from my mother, although I'm sure she did not create it. When you understand your audience, you will focus on their needs, and therefore you'll give them what they need. You'll tell them the time rather than build the clock. Most of us, when we communicate our message, we build the message to try to explain to people how we got there. Often it is better to explain where you arrived, and then, if important, explain how you got there. So tell the time first, then build the clock. That helps our audience. That helps get them rooted. It helps set their expectations. Further, when you're explaining something, explain the benefits to the audience. What is it that the audience gets from your point? How do they benefit? Rather than just talk about the different features or points. Focus on what your audience gains. There's a very important question you must answer for any audience immediately when you speak. So what? What's in it for your audience? What value do they derive? So we focus on benefits and we tell the time. Are there questions on anything I've said? We can make this interactive.
So tell the time. Could you just, rather than make the clock, so could you just repeat again, translate that into what that means?
Certainly. We want to give our goal first. Explain what we're trying to achieve up front rather than build the logic behind it first. Most people explain how they got there first. And if you don't know where you're going, it's really hard to appreciate the information you're getting. I'll talk back when I was a tour guide here on campus. I trained for a full quarter. To this day, I can walk backwards in a straight line because in training, all right, is anybody else in this room, were you a tour guide here? Okay, so you know what I'm talking about. At least back in my day, in the quad, we'd line up on one end and we had to walk backwards straight all the way to the other end. And if we didn't, they'd make us start over. It was like boot camp. Okay, I know lots of silly facts about buildings that no longer exist on campus. I've walked down the stairs of Hoover Tower just in case when you're up top something happened. So I was trained really well. But what do you think, and you guys can't participate because you know the answer. What do you think was the most important thing they taught us as tour guides? The single most important lesson they gave us? What do you think it was? Please. Eye cup, very important, not the most important, although it's related. Yes?
Get your group back to where they were supposed to be.
Right, so end up back where you started. Excellent. What else? Not the most important, though. Yes?
Find the restrooms.
Know where the restrooms were. That's part of setting people's expectations. The number one thing they taught us was never lose your tour group. As a tour guide, if you lose your tour group, you're not a very good tour guide. Right? And on this campus, they were worried about somebody getting hurt or something bad happening. So part of the reason tour guides walk backwards is so we can keep our eyes on all of you. Right? The same thing is true when you are giving a presentation or writing a document. Never lose your audience. Keep them focused. And the way you do that is by telling them the time first. A good tour guide starts by saying, today we're going to walk to Hoover Tower, then we're going to go to Memad. You give the directions first, so you set people's expectations so they know if they have to go to the bathroom first or they should change their shoes. Would you follow a tour guide that said, hi guys, let's go? Not many of us would. We want to know where we're going and why we're going there. So you have to bring the time first. Did that help? Excellent. Yes, please.
Does this work with interpersonal communication?
So the question is, does this idea of knowing your audience and setting expectations up front work with interpersonal communication? Many times it does, particularly when in conversations of consequence. Yeah. So when you're involved in making points that are very significant. In day-to-day chit-chat and conversation, you don't need to worry about this as much, but absolutely help people understand this is important and here's what I'm trying to achieve. Absolutely. Other questions? So let me share with you what this really boils down to. It boils down to really understanding your audience. And there's some fundamental questions you need to ask yourself. First, we need to ask, what does our audience know about the topic on which we're speaking? What do they know? Most of the time you're communicating, your audience has some background in what you're discussing. So you need to understand that knowledge. Okay? Second, what is it that they expect? Most of the communication you have with people is communication that has happened before. That is, they've had a communication act that's similar to the one you're having. I work with a lot of entrepreneurs, and they think that their pitch is the be-all, end-all of pitches. And it might be really good, but the people they're pitching to have heard lots and lots of other pitches. So you have to think about what expectations do they bring to that interaction? And how do I conform to those expectations or deviate from them? And then finally, you need to think about what are the areas of concern my audience might have? What is it that they might resist or be bothered by? And you need to address those issues, typically up front, because otherwise people carry them in their mind. They keep asking, but what about, but what about, but what about? And that gets in the way of them taking in your message. So we really need to understand our audience, who they are, what they know, and what they expect. But the audience isn't enough. We also have to understand the context in which we are presenting. Most communication happens in a context. I know that today, many of you are going to hear many presentations, not just mine. And that influences what I do and how I think about what I need to say. I might want to link some of the things I'm saying to things you might hear later on. You might be coming, now this morning this isn't the case, but you might be giving a presentation where people are coming to you after hearing other presentations. So you need to think of your presentation as it fits into the life of your audience. So the timing is important. the length of your presentation is important. So we need to think of these factors because they influence the experience of your audience. When we create presentations or write documents, we see them as these narrow, isolated events. But in fact, for our audience, they're part of a longer continuum. Does that make sense? Okay, many people don't think about that, and it influences how your audience perceives your message. So this is the first part of the equation. This is the knowledge piece. The next piece of our equation for credibility has to do with connection. Have any of you ever participated in, been the audience in, a boring presentation? I hope this is not it, okay? What good, effective speakers do is they connect to their audience. They pull them forward in their seats. It's the difference between watching a really good movie in black and white and a really good movie in 3D. The experience is different. In 3D, it's immersive. You feel like you're participating in it. Good, effective communicators draw their audience in. They connect with them. So I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about how we can connect to our audience. Because if your audience feels connected to you, then they are viewing you as somebody who knows what they're saying, and they are working with you to achieve your goal. It enhances your credibility. So let me suggest some techniques you can use. The first technique is to speak to the relevance of your information for your audience. Too often we just talk at our audience rather than with them. The best example I can think of is when giving data. Often people present data, impressive numbers, but those numbers might not be meaningful for people in their audience. Let me give you an example. I was working with an executive at Citibank, and he talked about the amount of money that goes through Citibank every day. It was a really, really big number, but I don't remember it. So what he did after he stated the number, he said that represents 25% of all the world's money every day goes through Citibank. I remember that. You might remember that now. Okay, the point is, he made it relevant, something I can understand. I've done some work with a company called Nest. They make these really cool learning thermostats. They talk about saving 1 billion kilowatts of energy. Sounds like a lot, but I have no reference point. Is that a lot or a little? So what they do is they make it something I can understand. They follow that up immediately by saying, that's as if you turned off all electricity in the United States for 15 minutes. Okay, now I get it. So they've made it relevant. So you want to make sure the information you convey is relevant to your audience. And notice the only way to do that is to really understand who your audience is. So that audience piece, the reason I present it first in the equation is it's critical in order to get the connection you need. Beyond relevance, we can talk about analogies. Analogies are critical for helping your audience connect to your content because you're linking something they already know to something you want them to know. And it buys you a lot. You don't have to explain as much if you can link it to something people already know. Another customer I worked with was in the big data space. They were all about helping people market better based on the data they know about their customers. But they were struggling going into some of their clients because their clients didn't understand the value of the data they had locked away in their servers. So they used an analogy. They'd get up and on the screen they would project an image of a Ferrari parked inside a garage. And they would say, your data is like this Ferrari parked in a garage. Ferraris are not meant to be parked in garages. They're meant to be driven and enjoyed. Your data is not giving you the value that it's meant to be or meant to have. And that helped their audience understand the importance of what this company offered. So an analogy can really help connect. So if there's a time where you're communicating or trying to convince an audience of something, link it to something they already know, and that will help you tremendously. It helps drive that connection.
Quick question.
Sure.
Small question. You're a word person, you're communicating. So why did you use the word advance analogies rather than use analogies?
So the question is what my language choice. So I am probably overly committed to alliteration in my life. Okay, and you will notice that all of these slides use alliteration. Okay, I like to play with things like that, so I had fun. So reveal relevance, advance analogies, invoke imagination. You see a pattern now? So. One way to be a compelling speaker is to use language creatively, and so this was my little homage to alliteration. So there is something to parsimony and saying things as clearly and crisply as you can. I was just having fun. Okay? So another audience connecting technique, a way to draw your audience in, is to invoke people's imagination. I can tell you things. And how many of you have ever seen a slide that somebody puts up that's just got bullet point after bullet point, right? Bullet points, they're called bullet points because bullets kill, right? It really drives, it can really put your audience to sleep. Rather than just going through a litany of bullet points, you can ask your audience to imagine. Imagine what it would be like if, rather than me saying, here's what we're going to talk about. And it doesn't always have to be imagination. Imagination is typically future thinking. You can talk about the past. You can say, remember when. This gets your audience doing something, asking them to imagine, asking them to remember. That gets them thinking rather than passively receiving. One of the things I enjoy doing, I listen to a lot of speeches. I listen to tons and tons of presentations. I once calculated I've heard over 13,000 presentations. And one of the things, and in order to do that and still be sane, I come up with a lot of different techniques. And one of my most favorite techniques is when I watch a presenter present, I don't always watch the presenter. I'll stand on the sideline and watch the audience watch the presenter. And when people use techniques like Invoke Imagination, advancing analogies, people actually lean forward. When you have a speaker that just recites bullet points, people lean back. So you can actually physically see people respond to these techniques. It's a way of connecting. It's a way of building that credibility. Finally, the most important concept is to connect to people through inclusive language. You, us, we, that pulls people in. Many speakers, because of their nervousness, because of the formality they perceive in the interaction, use distancing language. One must consider the ramifications, blah, 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 instead of this is important to you. I worked with another executive. He was doing this big keynote, and I was the only person in the room. I was sitting in the middle of the audience, and he said, the audience must consider. I looked around. Who the heck is he talking about? I'm the only person that he needs to say you should consider. So when possible, use inclusive language. Now, there are certainly times where the speaking situation is formal, and formal language is appropriate. But most of the time, conversational language works. There's a lot of research that says fidelity, that's the accuracy of the transmission of your message, is improved by conversational language. So there are many ways to connect to your audience. You connect by being relevant. You connect by linking what you're saying to things they already know. You connect by having them engage their mind rather than talking at them, talk with them. And finally, by using inclusive language. These techniques really help your audience become engaged. And if they're engaged, they see you as a more interesting and credible speaker, and it actually can help reduce some of your anxiety. If my audience responds the way I want them to as I'm speaking, that makes me feel good. Okay? So this all can help build our credibility.